Hey, this is Arthur Protasio from Fableware Narrative Design, and you are listening to We Are One, You Are Two PlayStation Podcast.
All right, everyone, we're back with another episode of We Are One, You Are Two, a PlayStation and video game podcast. I am your host, as always, Rob Fanzo. I'm joined once again, he's back this week, Matt Rose.
Heyo.
We are on Patreon, we're on SoundCloud, we are on iTunes, we're on Spotify, we're on Podbean. Pretty much look for us, you'll find us. I lied, we're not on SoundCloud anymore, I take that back. But look everywhere else and you'll find us. Matt, we've got a special episode line for listeners this week. It's actually probably going to be split into two parts. It's a special guest this week from Fableware Narrative. We have Arthur with us. We're going to bring him on shortly to talk about his new game, Sword Legacy Omen.
Sweet.
But I do want to spend a little bit of time, I thought you and I, before we bring him on, could talk a little bit about the game itself, so that those who are not aware, the game was released a few months ago, last year, on Steam, and it is still currently there. And he was nice enough to let us try it out. So, full disclosure, anything we talk about here is because those codes were provided to us by Arthur and Fableware Narrative Design. And so, just in case somebody wants to go out and say, oh, they're biased, blah, 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 they did provide it to us. So, but we're still going to give you our honest opinion here, because I don't want... even though he's our guest this week, I don't want anybody to think that we're just trying to score free points here with anybody. And so I've played a few hours of the game, and you have too. And so I thought we could talk a little bit about that before we bring Arthur on, and talk a little bit about our impressions with Sword Legacy Omen. Again, it is on Steam. And so, do you want to start, or shall I?
Yeah, no, I can start. I really quite enjoyed the time that I played it. Now, it is not it's not my style. I'll be first person to say that. I'm not really into a kind of turn-based thing. I mean, I've done it before, obviously. I love the South Park games, so and then of course that's turn-based. I'm generally not a big fan of it, but this was pretty cool. I thought it was pretty interesting about, like, you have the action points, and I was kind of surprised. The one guy who seemed more like the hero had like the least amount of action points, which I thought was kind of funny.
Yes.
Uther, right? So, like, I don't know.
Yes, King Uther.
Yeah, I thought, I was like, how like he's like the guy, or like it seems like he's the guy, and he has like the least. He's like 6 action points, and you're just like, all right, well, I can walk over here. That's about it.
Yeah, you do have a party of 4 to start.
You do, yeah. But you're also super powerful as well. So, like, once he's close enough, I mean, he does really good damage.
Yes, he does. He is quite strong. I will give him that.
Yeah. So it was pretty good. I don't know. I really enjoyed it. I thought I'm kind of ever the collector. So, like, I had played through it once, and I realized I had missed, like, one of, like, the little, like, lore things. Like, one of the little, like... Yeah, the lore is what it's called in the game. It's just, like, basically, like, kind of gives you background stories of what's going on. And so I replayed it, and then I think the second time I, like, died. One of my guys got killed, and I was like, I don't want to be without Merlin for a while. Because I wasn't sure. I just restarted, so I wasn't sure if maybe, like, you get those guys back, but I thought...
They are mortally wounded. I'll jump in, and they're mortally wounded, and so they will follow you, but they'll have, like, 2 hit points instead of their full 8 or 10 or whatever it is.
Okay.
And so they'll wander through the next battle with you, but then you wind up, they get killed with 1 hit anyway. At least in my experience so far.
Right.
And so you can get healing items.
Yeah. I hadn't reached a spot where I could get healing items yet, but yes, okay, that makes sense. So, but yeah, no, I enjoyed it. I did like the kind of animations. I love each one has their own kind of like kill animations, which I thought was kind of cool. And I'm sure as you progress and there's like, maybe you gain more people, they probably have their own kill animations as well. But you know, if you deal a final blow with specific characters, they have their own kind of specific things that happen to the guys, which is kind of cool. So, how about you, Rob? What do you think?
Yeah, and I would agree with that. You know, it's not my kind. I'll be the first to say too, and this is where I want to clarify that too. Turn-based RPG is not my style either. I've played more of them. Like I love the Persona series, you know, Final Fantasy back in the day, and so I really don't mind that. I just don't I typically play them on consoles. I don't typically play them on PCs, and so I know that. And I think Arthur would be okay with me saying this. He refers to it as a low-budget RPG, turn-style based. I really didn't mind it. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the lore in the world. Finding the little scraps of paper, finding the little things hidden around the world, whether they be scraps of paper or notes or notices or things that are stuck around. I really enjoyed that. I enjoy the exploration part. Like it's not difficult to move around. It looks gorgeous. You and I have talked about that with him in the interview that we'll get to here shortly. I loved it as well.
Yeah, the art style is awesome. It really is very well drawn, and it really has this really kind of polished look to it.
Yeah, and so I really enjoyed that stuff about it. I did die a few times. In the village where the pigs are, which is, you know, about the second or third mission in. I did struggle there a little bit, and that was because I didn't have access to health items, and so I already had 2 party members who were down to 2 out of 8 points. Merlin, or the Merlin-like figure, and the female thief. That makes it hard when you really have 2 fighting members that are really worth anything, and then of course one of them, like we mentioned, Uther. Isn't exactly, he's great up close, but he doesn't move very far.
Yeah.
And so that does make it a struggle. I almost have to let them come to me, but then there's always that freaking archer that's shooting you. So
right.
I did enjoy the gameplay mechanics. I enjoy the executions. They are a little dark and grim, but what's funny is because their cartoon style almost makes them a little lighthearted at the same time.
Yeah. Like with I don't know. I mean, I guess it's not giving too much away. This can happen right away, but like Merlin's one, he has a staff. When you do the final blow, like their brain pops out and just kind of like lays on the ground, which got, I don't know. I just thought it was hilarious.
Yeah, and I think is the kid with the axe, I sliced a guy in half.
Yeah.
His like guts came coming out. So that was kind of enjoyable.
Yeah, like they like fall apart and then all of a sudden their like guts ooze out.
Yeah, and so it's kind of, you know, and we'll see, he describes it in the interview as kind of a dark Disney, and I think that fits exceedingly well. Other things that I really enjoyed about it was collecting the items and reading the little bit of detail about each one of the items. I like that they've taken one of the legends of Great Britain and decided to explore it in a different manner, and mixed in some humor with it as well.
Yeah.
And I thought the writing was well done. Of course, Arthur is responsible for most of that, and we'll talk about that with him.
Yeah.
I think as a tactical RPG, right? And there's definitely a technical side to it. I mean,
oh, absolutely.
This is for your XCOM players. This is for your turn-based players who really enjoy strategy, because, you know, XCOM is a perfect example of what this game relates to. And I was never very good at XCOM. I was never good at moving my guys the right amount of squares to get them in position for the next attack or whatever. I was always terrible at that. And so that's probably why I'm terrible at this. But it doesn't stop me from enjoying it. It just, what happens is I hit a wall and I get frustrated, so I have to walk away. So you like that layer of depth, and you know me, I loved hard games, and so it's not like I'm going to shy away from it.
Oh, of course.
And you know, I love the map too, like the giant map that opens up.
Yeah.
You know, it makes me feel like I'm on a countertop, like planning some sort of massive strategy.
Yeah.
And so you'll see that early on in the game when you're moving between areas, there's a giant map that you can move through. And so, you know, I don't want to really go too far in depth with anything else, but the story seems interesting. You know, it starts off as kind of a classic tale, and so I'm kind of excited to see the twists and turns that come with that as well. But yeah, as a whole, you know, it's not my kind of game, but it's definitely the kind of game that I would recommend to people who have a love for tactical RPGs. And it's definitely something that I like picking up and playing. What I like about it is you can actually play it in small bursts.
Right.
You know, you can, if you have 20 minutes to a half hour, that'll get you through an area most of the time early on in the game.
Yeah.
Without much of a problem. And I'm a quick reader. And so, you know, the dialogue options, I fly through pretty quickly. And so that's, but you and I talked about that a little bit before air too, that you're not as quick of a reader. And so you still felt like you were able to get through the dialogue and at your own pace without a problem.
Yeah, it was kind of nice actually. And I do like that they have like the kind of skip to next line, which is like the right click button, because as a person who doesn't read very fast, it's kind of like, I'm like, all right, let me read this. And then, but even for me being a slow reader, I felt like there was still plenty of time for me to get through like the little dialogue bubble. So like I even found myself clicking the skip to next line thing, which was nice. I didn't feel like I was going to like miss out on any of the dialogue just because I'm a slow reader.
Exactly. Yeah. So overall, I mean, I really enjoyed it. I thought it was well done. It is definitely a game I would recommend.
Oh yeah.
And even if you're not a fan of the genre, certainly, just watch some gameplay videos. I think that if you're a fan of history, it's kind of fun to see what they've done with the tale of Uther and playing on the idea of, Arthur's family history here, before we get to Arthur.
Yeah. The one thing I will say, I want to ask you, did you, so like during some of the combat, there's like barrels or boxes you can hide behind. After combat was over, did you break any of those?
Yes, you get little treasures out of those.
Yeah. What's funny is like, it's super random too, because, when my one character died, I restarted and I had hit the same boxes and it didn't, the same stuff did not appear.
No, it did not. It's very randomized.
Yeah, which I thought was kind of cool that, just randomly you would get like coins or like a little trinket of health or whatever, something to boost your stats.
And I do know you can push those barrels. I haven't quite figured that out yet.
Oh, okay. I didn't even know that.
Yeah, if you read the instructions, it does mention something about being able to push the barrels and knock them into enemies.
Okay.
But for whatever reason, I don't know if I missed something in the instructions. I was struggling a little bit with that.
Yeah.
Most of the time, I would just end up slashing and breaking them. So that's something I have to explore a little bit more.
Cool.
All right, cool. Well, anyway, I think that'll wrap it up for the impressions. That's really all I have to say. I appreciate Arthur. Again, he provided this to us, and so if you want to take that as bias, that's fine. But I'm being honest, both. I mean, you and I both admit this is not our style of game, but we still enjoy it.
It's really not. Yeah.
And so I think and maybe that makes us less picky about the mechanics of it. But as a narrative-driven player, I'm okay with it because, it's simple, it's easy to pick up, and yet there's still enough strategy there that it's not something that you're going to breeze through if you're not familiar with the genre. If you are, you might have an easier time, but, good for you, I guess, because it's just, it's definitely a challenge.
Oh, for sure.
All right, cool. Well, with that being said, we'll go ahead and introduce Arthur. So here we go.
Sweet.
All right. As we mentioned before, it is time for our interview this week. This week we have guest Arthur Protasio. I say that correct or close enough?
Yeah. Good job.
All right, I'll take it. Joining us from Fableware Narrative Design. I'll take it. It's probably one of the easier ones I've had to pronounce. He's going to talk to us a little bit about his latest, as well as some of his background regarding, the development process. And so, Arthur, thanks for joining us today. We really appreciate you being here.
And thank you guys for having me as well. It's both a pleasure and an honor to be here, always discussing not only game development, but being able to talk about the personal and also professional process that goes into making a game.
Yeah, it's really nice to be able to hear from you guys on that because I think sometimes, and you see it more in the AAA space, people tend to forget that there are human beings behind the games that they play. And they tend to get a little angry or a little frustrated with things that are going on, but they have to realize there's a human being just like them that's breathing behind that artwork. So sometimes it can be a little messy like that, I think.
That's the human factor.
Yes,
for sure.
So, Arthur, why don't you tell us a little bit about, I was kind of curious because your company's Fableware Narrative Design. How did you you want to tell us a little bit about the history of the studio and how you kind of got it started and what your vision was for it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's of course I'm going to hear sort of like tell a long story short, but it is an interesting journey because I've always identified myself as a storyteller. I mean, just coming up with stories and finding different ways to tell them has always been my thing. I remember when I didn't even know how to write. I would ask for my grandmother to write down the dialogues for like comics that I drew. So I would always try to find ways to just come up with stories, weird or profound or funny or experimental, whatever. throughout my life, what I always tried to do, speaking as a career, but also, of course, as something that personally motivated me. I mean, there's no point in, at least that's how I feel, there's no point in pursuing a specific career if you're not intrinsically motivated to go after that. So I was always trying to find ways to tell stories. And games have always been part of my cultural life. I mean, alongside movies, alongside going to a theater and watching stage plays, alongside reading novels, books, literature. But the difference is, I mean, this is very natural to us who are familiar with games, but there's this interactive element that you just don't get to see in necessarily a lot of other mediums and languages and ways of telling stories. So I was always interested in telling stories, but also pursuing the more interactive ways of doing that. And fun fact, I didn't actually go to, let's say, like a film school or anything. I actually went to law school. And then what I tried to do by going to law school was actually finding ways of connecting art, culture, video games, and law together. It's interesting because it led me to a very interesting research regarding freedom of speech. And it helped me build this confidence to actually later on I worked with, and then past that, that's when I went to do my master's focused on interactive narratives, and also started working with TV series and writing for games, also researching games and animation, etc. So basically, I mean, I started pursuing both careers at the same time. And when I put everything together at one point, this was into late 2014, I had already worked with a series of projects like TV series and animation and games and VR, etc. And that's when I thought, hey, I think this is a nice point in my career to put all of this knowledge together in kind of like a neat little package and start presenting myself, actually not myself, but presenting this entity, which is actually Fableware, as an entity, a company, as a studio that can offer narrative design services. Because people knew me as Arthur, as an expert in narrative, as a specialist working with narrative, interactive or not. But people didn't come to me necessarily requiring services as work for hire. People just saw me as, in many ways, as this reference, as someone who researched narrative and someone who even worked with narrative, but it wasn't something directly connected to the industry. So by actually founding the company, what I did was sort of like a statement in which I said, hey, we've got a series of indie studios that know how to do art, program, they know production, they know game design. But what about using games or different mediums to tell stories in innovative ways, or thinking of these mediums as ways to tell stories, not just the about. I mean, we have a lot of stories that they can be action oriented, they can be dramas, they can be a series of things, but how you choose to tell that story, not only the what, makes a huge difference. So that's when I actually founded Fableware here in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And we're now in 2019. So throughout these years, it was actually a process of helping people understand the relevance of narrative design, starting in games, but then slowly spreading to other mediums as well. It was a very, very important process for me because now we have Sword Legacy, for example. It's not the only work that I've done. It's not like the only piece of the Fableware portfolio, but it is probably one of the most important projects because it is a product of Fableware and not necessarily a service. And that's something we're really proud of. And I think it goes a long way to show that there was this very intense narrative design work done with the game. Hopefully I managed to sum it all up, but it is a long story, as I said.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating one because you've taken, and it's something you don't hear too often, I think. It sounds like you've really taken you started off almost like a more academic approach to narrative design. You know, certainly law degree is no slouch there either. And so it's certainly a lot more academic driven. But I think that, you know, if you're going to work within narratives, you have to be well read. You have to be almost academically driven to be able to partake in a creative process like that, because it is something that is a lot of work and requires a lot of knowledge.
You're absolutely right. Something that I missed a lot. I mean, you're absolutely right when you say that career-wise, I probably started building from ground up academic-wise. I was always writing. I mean, I've always been into writing short stories or writing pretty much anything that would interest me. But the thing is, I think I saw the academia as an interesting avenue to pursue in order to create this connection of being knowledgeable about something and then applying that knowledge in practice. So I've always wanted, like, since I recognize my existence, I've always wanted to put this knowledge into practice and write, and I've always done that. But of course, making the switch from an academic professional to someone who's working in the industry makes a difference. And I think that opening up the studio, founding the studio, was a very important part of this process. However, of course, as I mentioned, before starting the studio, that's when I was doing a lot of freelance work and slowly showing people that, hey, I have knowledge about this topic, but I'm also qualified to create something with these skills and put together this project or put together this story. So that's how I remember when I worked on probably my first commercial professional contract project, and it was actually an advert game. And I mean, I was working on a script for a game that was actually created to work as sort of like a product placement strategy. And I mean, people usually don't look at advert games and think, wow, that's glamorous, that's luxurious, that's where I want to be career-wise. But it definitely helps you take a first step to understand how can you still tell a good story, even if it is supposed to, at the end of the day, serve this specific trademark, you know?
Yeah. All right. Yeah, absolutely. I understand that. And then, again, that's an impressive way to have worked your way through to where you are now. And so that's great to hear about as well, because I think so often people want to just jump into and say, well, you know, I want to do game design or narrative design. I'll jump straight into it. But there's always that path that will lead you there. It might just be something that will give you that experience to kind of, when you're ready for that leap, that you've got that background.
Yeah. I mean, if, as long as you're determined and you want to get somewhere, I don't think there's ever a right path. I just think that you need to be proactive and, I mean, just face whatever problems are in your way and build a portfolio, of course. And that you can only do, of course, by getting your hands dirty and actually building things and writing things. But as an interesting fact, I initially thought I wanted to be a game designer, and only by actually creating games, developing and designing games in game jams or whatever, that I started realizing that although I do enjoy game design, I do enjoy game design when it's connected to the message that I want to convey through that experience. So that's why narrative design is more my thing, because I'm not interested in necessarily the detailed math that goes behind deciding whether or not how much damage your sword is going to do, but rather what emotions you can evoke by having a sword do a lot of damage.
Okay. Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. And I will say, as somebody that's more of a narrative driven gamer myself, that I need some sort of story. I think that's important to me, particularly when I play. I do want something that is going to give me an experience that tells a story for me. As much as I love gameplay, there's something about a story that just will stick with you much longer.
I think it's kind of like game design as a metaphor, you know, like what message do the mechanics convey? Because the way in which you interact with them makes you feel something. So, I mean, I'm definitely, of course, obviously a narrative-driven professional and a player as well. But I can still think of games that are, in a way, considered simple. I mean, when it comes to their production values, but they're still very effective at telling stories. One of my favorite games, for example, is Papers, Please.
Yeah, that's a great game. I'm just playing through that now, actually.
Really?
Yeah.
have fun. It's a very neat game.
Awesome.
Cool. It's funny to me, like when you talked about like, you started off as a lawyer as well. For some reason, that kind of made sense to me. Like it didn't seem that far of a leap because like, I don't know, when I think of a lawyer in the courtroom, he's kind of pushing his narrative and he's kind of, examining it for his client or, driving the narrative the way he wants to in the courtroom with asking the questions and like the, the witnesses and stuff. So for me, it doesn't seem that kind of far of a leap, even though when you say lawyer and, game developer, it doesn't exactly, mesh right. It seems kind of weird juxtaposition, but I don't know. I feel like it's not that big of a leap, especially when you're talking about narrative design.
Unless you're playing Phoenix Wright.
But talk about the reception of Sword Legacy Omen. Like, what kind of like feedback have you gathered so far from the media and like people who've played it?
Okay, so what's really cool about Sword Legacy, I think that it's first and foremost, it's really interesting for us to, and I speak on behalf of the whole team. So what's really cool about Sword Legacy is it's actually a 2-studio game. It's developed by Fableware, and obviously, as the name implies, with a focus on narrative design. But the project actually started in late 2014 with Firecast, also a game development studio here from Rio de Janeiro. And they were the ones who thought of the initial concept of, hey, let's create a tactical RPG, a turn-based tactical RPG. And we wanted to have sort of like a cartoon look. But there was this concept, and eventually we evolved this concept into, hey, we're drawing a lot of inspirations and references from Disney. We're drawing a lot of references and inspirations, mechanically speaking, from games like Final Fantasy Tactics, from Fire Emblem, of course, from Banner Saga, XCOM, etc. And eventually we made a transition into something darker, more Game of Thrones-like, thinking specifically of the TV series.
Very nice.
And yeah. And then we also combined that with a rereading, a retelling of the King Arthur legend. So the idea is that, and before anyone thinks, how convenient, Arthur is talking about a game about the King Arthur legend. So before you hold that thought, the game is actually about Uther Pendragon, King Arthur's father,
Yes.
before King Arthur is even born, but you do get to play with Uther and Merlin. So we wanted to actually put a spin on the idea that the gist of the myth, probably what happened starting from the Sword in the Stone. But what happens before you get to that point? What happened before the sword was actually put into that stone, or how did the sword get into that stone? So we do this retelling, reimagining of, and then there's this mix. So I mentioned Game of Thrones, but we don't usually mention it explicitly, because I do think Game of Thrones, by combining the fantastical and medieval elements, is a stronger reference. But there's this historical element that I do remember borrowing very much from Vikings. So you do have actual realms, or we make reference to actual realms like Mercia, Northumbria, Anglia, Kent, and Wessex in the game. So we do put a spin on this. We mix a bit of history with no historical accuracy in mind. It's not our goal here. We just want to create this mix and match of reality, history, and fantasy. And then how does all of this tie? You asked about the reception, right? So The game industry here in Brazil is maturing. In the past decades, we've evolved a lot. But one thing that did catch our eye, and that has to do with the reception of the game, when we were still developing, was that we showed the game around, and from the start, Sword Legacy was always meant to be an international project. This was before we even partnered with Team 17 as our publisher. So we showed the game around, and people here in Brazil would be like, whoa, wait, how cool. This game looks awesome, but wait, is it Brazilian? And then this is sort of like a tragic, comedic comment, because on one hand, we would be like, wow, of course this game is Brazilian, and we're super proud to be showing it around. But on the other hand, we would realize that this meant that a lot of Brazilians, or a lot of people here who consume a lot of games in Brazil, are more used to the AAA games rather than understanding that we have a very pungent and vibrant indie community as well.
Yeah.
So that specific comment was really interesting to hear because it made us confident in the sense that we were creating an international product, but we also wanted it to obviously please the Brazilian audience. We are Brazilians, and I mean, I say this every time. It's not just because we are creating or we created the game about this universal European myth that it doesn't translate to the Brazilian audience. I mean, Dungeons and Dragons is definitely part of the Brazilian culture. Everyone here, every geek will know what D&D is. You know, yeah, no, I'm dead serious. I'm dead serious. I mean, people watch the Dungeons and Dragons cartoons with Eric, Presto, Bobby. I can't remember all the names. Diana and I forget the name of the girl in the purple cloak. But Shayla, there we go. So I mean, we had people watch the cartoon. So this is part of our culture as well. And then it was really cool to see this reception from this internal perspective, from this national perspective, people admiring the game and people wanting to play it. Let's fast forward a few months, perhaps even some years. And then we've released the game. And what's really cool to see is that this international approach that we had in mind managed to reach its goal. So the countries, from a sales perspective, the countries that most buy Sword Legacy are in order: United States, Russia, and then we have, I can't remember exactly which order. I think it's Germany, then France, and Brazil. And these are actually the 5 languages in which we have the game localized to. So the game was originally written in English. So that's the work that I did with my narrative team. We wrote everything in English, and English is, in fact, the original language. If you ask me, hey, Arthur, which language should I play Sword Legacy in? I mean, you can play the game in whatever language. Each of these 5 languages, you can pick one, whichever you want. But we wrote everything in English, and I do think that a lot of things are more natural in English because that's how it began. But we wrote it in English because we also knew that it was easier to take the game to other languages such as Russian, German, French, and of course Brazilian Portuguese. It's really cool to see people enjoying not only the fact that the game is available in these specific languages, but also that they really liked the spin that we put on the King Arthur myth. They also liked very much the fact that we always maintained this nostalgic feel of the art direction. So if you look at Sword Legacy, it is this, I like to joke that it's kind of like Disney gone wrong. So
yeah, it is a gorgeous game in that regard. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I do think that that is our main hook. I mean, when it comes to, if you watch a trailer, if you see a screenshot, that is the eye candy hook that we wanted to evoke by making people think of the classic Disney animations that they watched, even in the 1980s. So Black Cauldron, for example, is one of a very strong reference for us aesthetically. Not commercially, because Black Cauldron was a flop, but aesthetically, it is like an animation that we love. But we wanted to combine that, you know. So people do compliment that a lot. You see a lot of player reviews and website reviews just saying that the look and feel and the animation is something that really evokes this, hey, this looks like Disney, but wait, something's off, you know?
Yeah.
I do remember this one specific quote from a website that I loved it. It was something like, this game is amazing and it looks like it was illustrated by Disney. If Disney had done a game about King Arthur's dad set in a plague ridden England full of bodies everywhere. So, I mean, I really like, so that really sets the tone, you know? But then what's also cool is that as the narrative director of the game, I had a very strong concern in also conveying this dark tone. I mean, at one point, and this is a very, very, very interesting kind of like development story, is that at one point the game was not dark and obscure and just grim. It actually looked, seriously, it actually looked like a cute Disney animation. And what happened was that we had this very serious Game of Thrones Vikings-like story, but the visuals were like, you saw Prince Charming bleed to death, and it felt really weird. It just didn't work out. So that's when we actually we did like this huge revamp when it came to the aesthetic of the game, in which we started looking at Merlin. Merlin at some point was your classic wizard with the blue whiz hat, like wearing the glasses. And it felt like you could sit down for a chat next to a fireplace and he would tell you all about stories to put you to sleep. And if you take a look at Merlin now, I mean, he's this crazy mix of an alchemist with the hobo, he's just really weird, And, but that really is his nature in the game. He's this really weird character that you can't really put your finger on and say whether he's good or bad, or even if good or bad is a thing in this specific universe, So I think these are the elements that we enjoyed the most. Of course, being a tactical RPG, a lot of people also praise the challenge of the game. It isn't meant to be an easy game. So a lot of people talk about the fact that, we have over 10 unlockable skills for each character. So there is a lot of content to go through as you progress through the game. But it's really cool to see players progressing and experiencing this darker twist on a myth that is well known by the whole world, and also evoking this weird nostalgia, which isn't your classic nostalgia based on the Disney animations.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned Black Cauldron, because looking at the animation inside the game, I almost immediately thought like this is like a weirdly this is like a super dark Sword in the Stone, like the old 1960s Disney animation, and that's but it looks gorgeous because of that. Like it has this kind of like refined, professional, like high end Disney kind of production value to it, with this like really grim kind of dark tone to it, which I love.
Yeah, and it's just to make things clear is that sometimes we can think of making things more violent for the hype, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And I do remember, so we have overkills in the game, kind of like these executions. And one of the references that I brought to the team for these executions, two references actually. So they were the gruesome deaths from like the first Fallout, I think, because it was the isometric view. I can remember if it was Fallout 1 or 2. But they had like these gruesome deaths, and then you also have these specific executions in like Shadow of Mordor. And then one of the art director of the game brought forth a very interesting reference of a game, I think, called Immortal. And then it's like really early, if I'm not mistaken, 1980s. I'm not mistaken. Perhaps it was released for the Sega Genesis. Not sure. Can't remember right now. But it was this like, you're this weird wizard sorcerer going through a maze, kind of like a dungeon crawling game. And you had these weird deaths as well. So we wanted to bring that forth, but the violence doesn't happen all the time. It's not meant to be this game in which like everyone you touch just bursts into a meat explosion. It's not like everyone is dying with the critical hit from Baldur's Gate.
Yeah.
That's
so you're saying there's no like Mortal Kombat style in like any kind of influence.
I can tell you that no one gets their head ripped out with their spine.
Okay, all right, fair enough. Right. So it's not that dark.
But we do, it depends. It's a matter of perspective. We do get people getting cut in half and the gut spilling out. That happens, So one of the examples that I really like is depending on the overkill with Fergus. So Fergus he's this picked character, and he's from what we call the Beyond. Of course, that's in the world of Britannia, that's what we use as the equivalent for what would later be Scotland. Mm-hmm. And then we have this very strong and brutal warrior, barbarian, that hails from the north, and he wields an axe. So there's this overkill in which he comes with the axe, descending on the opponent vertically, and you don't get to see, I mean, the axe never goes like, it's not like a Mortal Kombat fatality in which you're gonna split the character in half. I mean, the axe just goes probably like up to actually goes down to the chest, and that's pretty much it. The character dies, obviously, because come on, who's gonna survive that? But it's not meant to be like, hey, let's spill guts everywhere. You do have, there are gruesome deaths, but they're meant to be gruesome deaths that represent, even if in a cartoon-like way, the viscerality of medieval combat.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's something that helps contribute to kind of what you're talking about as a whole, the narrative design before too, because it does kind of convey, it wouldn't make sense, to kind of have something going the other way, to the extreme, but then also to limit the amount of the way that something like that occurs throughout the game as well. It fits within the context of your narrative that you've designed and your world, your atmosphere that you've certainly designed as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's I mentioned jokingly, but I did mention the critical hit deaths in Baldur's Gate, and you don't have permadeath in Sword Legacy because it is a story-driven game, and you don't have, this huge variety of characters to a point where they can die and the story still continues. But even if you don't have permadeath, you do have, of course, specific death animations for each of the main characters, and if you do deal a critical hit that kills an enemy, that's when you activate the overkill, and not when you just randomly kill someone.
Right.
Interesting.
All right, that was our part one of our interview with Arthur. Very interesting guy. Glad he was able to join us. We'll bring you part 2 next week, so stay tuned.
Stay tuned. This is the part 1 outro music. Stay tuned for the rest of the thing next week. This is the part out. Oh.